예, 안녕하십니까. 오늘 바쁜 월요일인데도 이렇게 많이 참석해 주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 그럼 아침 특별 강연을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a busy Monday morning, but still you joined us. I welcome you and thank you very much for your attending here. Well, since Mr. Donald Trump has been was inaugurated as President of the United States. His new administration has been initiating various policy packages and policy reforms. Certainly, they will have very significant impacts on the U.S. economy and the whole world. And therefore, we are very much interested in what's going on in the United States. And I'm sure you heard a lot about so-called Trumponomics and the new policy initiatives. This morning, we are very, very fortunate to have, I always consider it the most distinguished and respected scholar and teacher in economics of our time, and who happened to be my good friend for many years, Professor Martin Feldstein. He has been with us many times before, so I don't think I need a long introduction for him, but except to say that he is currently I always forget this, George Baker, the professor of economics at Harvard. And, he has been with the government under the President Reagan, and also he served in different capacity, the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration as well, in consultative and advisory capacity. More than that, actually he served National Bureau of Economic Research nearly 30 years, and he still is the CEO, the Chairman Emeritus, the NBER. You know, the NBER is the most prestigious authoritative research organization during the last 100 years in the United States. He has been a really legend there at NBER. And then he occasionally also serves on various the public corporations as director and consultative capacity. I think this time he is also advising Citadel, which is the leading financial investor in major financial markets all over the world. I understand the Citadel manages over $10 billion of capital in various financial markets. When he was very young, he's still very young, but by the way, we're the same age. He was received the most prestigious award for young economist under 40, which is John Bate Clark Award of the American Economic Association. And actually, later on, he served as the president of American Economic Association. That also shows the evidence of how respected he is among his peers and in academia. When I'm particularly thankful to him this morning, he just arrived from the United States at 5 o'clock this morning. And then he's traveled from Florida to New York and then New York to Seoul. And then this afternoon he has to go to Hong Kong and Beijing. Since we're such a good friend, and I asked him to meet with you, and he's here. He just arrived, and I suppose he got just some refreshment. So I'm really grateful for that. Well, since we don't have much time, so I would like to invite Professor Feldstein. Before I do that, I will just recognize this presence of Mr. Nepper, who is chargé d'affaires of U.S. Embassy here. Yes, okay. I just found out that he speaks better Korean than I do. He really no accent at all. And he speaks fluent Japanese that I know because he studied at the University of Tokyo, Japanese. And then we have Mr. Yu. He's 김포 시장님이십니다. City Mayor of Gimpo. And thank you very much for that. And then we have many ambassadors. But since we don't have time, let me stop here. And let me invite Professor Feldstein. Please welcome. Please join me.
Well, as my friend Il Sarkang said, we have known each other for many, many years. I think I first met him when he was finance minister, and we had stayed close for years since then, talking about the problems of our two economies. So I always, whenever I come to Seoul, I get in touch with him in advance, and he's always kind enough to organize a breakfast like this. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I'm going to focus my remarks on the U.S. economy, but I'll also say a bit about what I see happening in Europe and elsewhere. This year is a much more interesting year for economic policy in the United States than the last few years when I came here. When I came here for the last few years, the only policy question was, well, what's the Federal Reserve going to do? Or more accurately, what excuses are they going to give us for not doing very much? But now we've got a major legislative agenda and a major policy agenda over and above the legislation in the new Trump administration. And frankly, I guess I can't say anything off the record in this room. What we're seeing are some puzzling things, I'll put it that way, in which the policies that the administrations, that the top people in the administration are doing seem very different from what President Trump said during his campaign. As you all know, one of the things he said was, well, Korea is going to have to take care of itself. We're not going to be doing that. And then the first thing that the Secretary of Defense did, General Mattis, was to come to Korea and say, we are here to be with you and to defend you, and moving ahead with the THAAD missile installation. So, and the same was true about Japan. He said about China, the president said about China, that we're not going to just go along with the one China policy unless we get something for it. Well, that's gone away. He has made it clear that he supports the one China policy. So now you can hear what I'm saying. It's good. So I think it is a puzzling time to try to understand what is happening. So far, the administration has only been there for a matter of weeks. The senior people have been appointed, the cabinet level people, but not the people under them. So they really haven't been able to start major programs. Yet we can make some inferences from two things. One, the fact that in domestic areas, particularly in the tax area, the White House will depend on the programs developed by the Republicans in the House of Representatives, by Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and his colleagues. And we can also make some inferences from the people who have been appointed to head some of the agencies, the kind of policies that they are likely to pursue, which need not be the same things that the president said during the campaign. So what I want to do is talk about those, but first let me say some things about the state of the U.S. economy and the outlook for Federal Reserve policy, but then I'll focus on the policy directions more generally. Basically, the U.S. economy now is in very good shape. I think when I was here about a year ago, I probably said the U.S. economy is in good shape. Now I'll say it's in very good shape. So we have an unemployment rate that came out just the other day of 4.7%. We added 235,000 jobs, more than you need to keep up with the growth of the population. So, indeed, if you look at the unemployment rate among college graduates, it's less than half of that 4.7%. Not surprisingly, with a tight labor market like that, average hourly earnings are rising, the labor force participation is rising, and inflation is not only up, but is rising more rapidly. So over the last 12 months, the consumer price index is up about 2.5%. If you look at the last 3 months, it's up 4.4%. I'm not saying that it'll stay rising at 4.4%, but it gives you a sense of how tight product and labor markets are. I think if we look ahead, even without the new policies, which I think will increase demand in the U.S., even without that, we will see increases in demand, increases in economic activity. The key part of that will come from consumers, since in the U.S. consumption is about 70% of GDP. Consumers are going to be spending more because they're confident about the future, with a low unemployment rate, with wages rising, with the value of their major asset, their home, increasing in real terms over the last 12 months by more than 3%, and more generally, the value of their portfolio assets, their total net worth, including housing, up more than 4% in real terms. The survey of household consumer sentiment has hit peak levels in the last few months. So I think we're going to see households continuing to support a strong economy. Business investment is also looking up, not surprisingly, because profits are up, capacity utilization is up, the cost of equity capital is way down because of the strong stock market. So I think we'll see business investment supporting a stronger growth. Last year we had a very poor growth of real GDP, 1.6%. I think this year it's more likely to be about 2.5%. I won't be surprised if we see some quarters of 3%. Let me say as a footnote on that I've been studying in detail how the U.S. government, the U.S. statisticians, produce these estimates of real growth of income, real growth of wages, and so on, and it's not very good. The technical problems of dealing with product change, new products, and quality improvements, they just don't get it. So I think these numbers that we quote all the time, that we read in the papers, and that are depressing many Americans because they say, oh, incomes just haven't risen significantly for decades, I think they're wrong. I think the true numbers are substantially higher than that. But maybe we come back to that in the questions. What I want to do before I talk about the Fed is say something about the risks that I see facing the U.S. economy in the near term, the next 12 to 24 months. Because while I think we are in very good shape now, I think we are also facing some serious problems going forward. What are these risks? I think there are three kinds of risks. The first is the risk that asset prices will come down significantly, and if they do come down significantly, that will hurt real economic activity. Why do I think asset prices could come down significantly? Because over the last decade, interest rates have been exceptionally low. As a result of Fed policy, we've had interest rates very close to zero, and so investors and lenders are reaching for yield, trying to get something at a time when the traditional investments are paying off so little. And the result is they have bid up the price of all kinds of assets. So if we look at equities, the Standard & Poor's index of share prices relative to the underlying earnings is now more than 60% higher than its historic average. That doesn't mean it's going to go back to its historic average, but boy, it's certainly more likely to come down than to keep rising at the recent rate. Bonds, 10-year treasuries have an interest rate of 2.5%. With the current level of economic activity, the current inflation, 10-year treasuries should probably be 4.5%. So they could normalize, they could return to that sometime in the next year or two, meaning, of course, that the price of those bonds would come down. In addition to that, we see credit spreads are narrow, and the prices of commercial real estate are way out of line with history. So I think that's where we could see some event. I'm not smart enough to know what that triggering event would be, but some event that would cause a decline in those asset prices, leading to adverse effects on the economy as a whole. The second risk that worries me is the risk associated with our budget deficit and our national debt. Over the last 10 years, the national debt has increased relative to GDP, has doubled relative to GDP. So if you go back a decade or beyond that, further back, we had a debt to GDP ratio of about 35%, and it's now 75%. And the Congressional Budget Office says if there are no new policies that add to the deficit, nothing to add to the debt to GDP ratio 10 years from now will be about 90%. That's very worrying. And many of the policies that the administration is thinking about could push that up even more. So the danger is the bond markets may get nervous about those rising debt to GDP ratios. If that happens, we could see long rates rising faster, and that could trigger some of the asset price corrections that I mentioned a moment ago. And the third risk is the risk of trade conflict. President Trump made some very strong statements about trade. Most of those were conditioned, though. For example, he would say, if I can't get a better deal with Canada, I will tear up the U.S.-Canada trade agreement. But the key thing is the word if I can't get a better deal. So it's not a commitment to tear it up. It's a statement that he wants to negotiate and get something better. But some of the people who are in the White House, some of the people who are in the administration at senior levels are eager to see a more protectionist policy. And the danger is if we go down that road, it will cause retaliation by others. Personally, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that in the end, the leadership that will come from the Treasury, from the Special Trade Representative's office will be much more in line with our history. Just as I said about foreign policy, about security policies, I think we will see them. But it's a risk. It's a risk that bad ideas will come to dominate and will trigger something that we won't like. So those are the things that worry me. Let me shift and say something now about the Federal Reserve. As I said a moment ago, the Fed has kept interest rates extremely low. The federal funds rate, the short-term interest rate, is now less than 1%. The Federal Open Market Committee said that they would raise interest rates this year 3 times. Everybody assumes that means 3 25-point increases. And if they do that, which would be a surprise in a sense because they've been making statements about what they're going to do and then not doing them, I think they will do this. I think they will do it because I think when Janet Yellen steps down as chairman of the Fed next year, early next year, she would like to look back and say, I made a promise, I said we would do this, and we did it. But even if they do that, we will still have an interest rate at the end of 2017, which is less than 2%, and therefore less than our inflation rate. And that's just wrong in an economy that's at full employment with inflation at our target and rising more rapidly. So I think it's a problem, and we'll see. But I don't think there's a lot of choice in what the Fed is going to do. I think they will push up rates 3 times and still leave us with a very low real interest rate. The more interesting question about Fed policy is who is going to be the new chairman? Who is going to succeed Janet? And who's going to succeed, and her term is up in February. And who is going to succeed Stan Fisher, the vice chairman, whose term is up a couple of months later? There are already 2 vacancies on the Fed that the president can fill. One other member of the Fed has said he's stepping down in the next month or so. So that's another position to be filled. So it's going to be a totally different cast of characters a year from now. And we don't know what they want. Do they want somebody who is going to be tough on inflation, focusing on financial instability? Or do they want somebody who will continue to keep interest rates extremely low in order to stimulate growth, since the president has spoken about his desire to have stronger economic growth? The danger is that they will opt for that second possibility, that will mean continued very easy money, that will add to the financial stability risks, and that will also drive up inflation. But we don't know, but it's certainly the thing to watch. Well, let me turn from where we are, where I think we're going, to the policy issues, because it is really a fascinating time for anybody like me who's interested in economic policy. So I've already said some things about national security policy and the fact that the president during the campaign made a number of statements which have already been reversed. But what about domestic policies? I think there are 4 areas of domestic policy that will unfold during this year. And nobody can be sure of exactly how that's going to come out, because there isn't a unified position within the White House. There isn't a unified position among Republicans. So the good news from making policies this year is that the Republicans control the Congress, the House of Representatives. Republicans have a majority in the Senate, and Republicans, of course, control the White House. This is something we have seen only once in the last several decades. So it's a real opportunity, but at the same time, there are strong disagreements among Republicans in the House, in the Senate, between the House and the Senate. So all I can do is give you a description of what the proposals are and what I think is likely to happen. I think that there are 4 areas There's the health insurance reform, there's the infrastructure policy, there's regulation, and most important, there are the tax proposals. The health insurance is essentially a repeal and replace of what has come to be known as Obamacare. It was not a well-received policy. Many Americans are unhappy with it. Finding a substitute turns out to be very difficult because of the details of the healthcare sector and the way in which that policy transfers money to state governments. But I expect that we will see something. The president has come out and said he supports the policy that the House leadership and the Senate leadership are in favor of. And so even though there are going to be opponents within the Republican Party, and of course from the Democratic side, I think we will see a significant reform of our health insurance system, and I think that'll get enacted by May. So that's a dangerous kind of forecast to make. The best forecasts are long-term forecasts, so you'll forget it. But come May, you'll be able to say, did Marty get it right or not? So the second thing is infrastructure. There's been a lot of talk about that. The president and the campaign said, I'm in favor of doing $1 trillion worth of infrastructure spending over the next 10 years, or $100 billion a year. And he had a meeting the other day in the White House to reinforce that message. But he said, we're not going to have the government pay for this. This is going to be paid for mostly by private industry. And we will use tax subsidies to encourage private industry to do it. I don't think you can find $1 trillion worth of revenue-producing projects that private industry would want to do. You know, I think it would be great if they paved the roads in my town. We've got potholes, it's really a mess. Can't make any revenue out of doing that. And that's true for a lot of things that Americans say, why can't we repair the bridges and all that? So I think in the end, they're not going to do $1 trillion. I think if they get half that, if they get $500 billion, the president will be able to point to a bridge there and a road there and an airport improvement someplace and say, look at all the great things we did. It'll be easy to get the Democrats to support it because it creates union jobs. So, but it's not much of an economic policy. $500 billion over 10 years, roughly $50 billion a year, 0.25% of GDP, it just doesn't do much. Fortunately, we don't need much. So usually one thinks of infrastructure spending as a way of stimulating the economy. So if you're in the kind of deep hole we were in 10 years ago, yes, infrastructure made sense. President Obama talked about having shovel-ready projects. There weren't any shovel-ready projects, so they ended up using a very large deficit, so-called stimulus program, to transfer money to state governments to cut taxes for low-income people, but not the kind of infrastructure that they talked about and that President Trump is talking about. So I don't think it'll have much of an impact one way or the other. Regulation, on the other hand, is very important. And the president has appointed people to the Labor Department, the Environment Department, and will pick people for the Fed who are interested in making changes in financial regulation. So I think we will see some serious deregulation. If you ask businesses what do they care about most, they would say they care about the burdens of regulation. They care about the increasing complexity of regulation, the number of people they have to hire to work on regulation, the hours that they and their board of directors spend on regulation issues. So it's something that there's strong pressure on the administration to do. President Reagan also wanted to cut back on regulation, And I think of the things that he wanted, bringing down inflation, bringing down domestic spending, building up the defense, reducing regulation was one that really failed, that he didn't get the kind of changes he wanted. I am more optimistic about President Trump's team in bringing that up because of the people that he's put into those positions and because the regulation burden has gotten much greater in the last 8 years. So I think we will see some of that. Finally, I come to the tax reform, which is the most important of the policies, and also the thing that will have the biggest impact outside the United States as well as within the United States. There will be a personal tax reform, standard Republican personal tax reform. Bring down tax rates at the top and throughout the distribution and make that up, finance that by broadening the tax base, by eliminating some of the deductions and exclusions and other tax expenditures. So the more interesting thing is the corporate tax reform. And let me tell you about that. There are 4 parts to it. The first is to bring down the top marginal tax rate that corporations face. American companies face a marginal tax rate on corporate profits of 35%. That's the highest rate among industrial countries in the world. So there is an agreement to bring that down to somewhere probably in the 20% range, basically cutting that rate in half if they can afford to do it. So that would be a major change that would attract capital to the corporate sector, attract it from other parts of the economy, that would encourage investment, that would stimulate growth. I think it's a very good thing, but it's expensive. The corporate tax raises about 2% of GDP, and so if it gets cut from 35% to roughly half that, that means you have to find 1% of GDP to finance that. 1% of GDP is about $190 billion. That change in taxation will lead to faster growth. That'll produce some revenue. So maybe in the end, the net cost is $150 billion. But that's a big problem. And I'll come back to how they propose to finance it. The second thing is to change to what's known as a territorial tax system. The U.S. is, I think, unique among industrial countries in not having a territorial tax system. What it means is this: U.S. subsidiaries of U.S. companies doing business abroad, in Korea, in Europe, and wherever, have to pay, of course, the local corporate tax on the profits of those subsidiaries. And if they bring those profits back to the United States, they have to pay the 35% tax that we levy on profits, minus a credit for what they've already paid. So if you are producing in Ireland with a 12% corporate tax, you pay 12% to Ireland, but then when you bring it back, you'd have to pay another 23%. So guess what? They don't bring it back. So the money piles up because you don't have to pay the U.S. tax as long as you keep it out of the country under current law. So they invest in plant and equipment, in businesses, they acquire businesses, or they simply build up cash portfolios. And it's estimated that there's more than $2 trillion of that overseas investment that came from the profits of U.S. subsidiaries. So the proposal is to move to what is called a territorial system, which means, and which is what other countries do, which means that after paying the tax in wherever you earn your profits, in Korea, in Germany, in Ireland, you can bring them back to the United States for only a very small tax, maybe 5%. What about the $2 trillion that's accumulated? The proposal is to have a tax on that, once and for all tax on that, a so-called deemed repatriation tax, meaning treat it as if it's being brought back at some number like 10%. You don't have to pay it if you're an American corporation, American subsidiary all at once. Probably they would be given 5 or 10 years to pay it. But then you're free to bring back any of that $2 trillion. Well, the estimates are that this combination of dealing with the existing funds plus any new profits would mean a substantial inflow into the United States of profits that otherwise would remain abroad. And some of those profits might be used to pay more dividends, but I think with the low corporate tax rate, a lot of that would end up investing in the United States, stimulating growth in the US economy. I think both of those parts are going to happen. I think that the exact tax rates are still up in the air, but I think both of those will happen. The third part of the corporate tax plan is to move to what is called a cash flow basis of taxation. What does that mean? It means that companies would not be allowed, companies would be allowed to expense, to write off immediately any spending that they do on new investments. So instead of depreciating them over a period of time, they would get to write them off immediately. But in exchange for that, there would also be an end to interest rate deductions on new loans. So that's a pretty radical change. I think the odds are against it happening. But as I talk to some of the congressional leaders, they take it very seriously. They think it is something that they want to do and that would be better for the US economy. So I put that one sort of in quotes. And then finally, there's something quite controversial in the US, and that is the border adjustment tax. What in the world is that? If you read the stories in the newspaper about it, I would say 2 out of 3 get it wrong. So let me tell you what it really is and what its purpose is. Its purpose is to increase revenue. If it works the way it's expected to work, it would produce about $120 billion a year in revenue, and that would be enough to pay for almost all of the cut in the corporate tax rate. So what's the mechanism? Basically, companies that import would have to pay a tax on those imports, just as they would with a value-added tax system. And companies that export would get a subsidy on those exports as they would with a value-added tax system, even though the U.S. doesn't have a value-added tax, but we would treat these as they would be under a value-added tax system. Well, the U.S. imports about 15% of GDP and exports only about 12% of GDP. So this 20% tax on the imports, on the 15%, is greater than the 20% subsidy on the exports, and that difference is where the revenue comes from. Turns out to be roughly 3% difference in GDP terms, 20% of that, 0.6% of GDP. Doesn't sound like much, but in the US case, that's $120 billion. So that's what the leadership in the Congress is counting on to finance this major cut in the corporate tax rate. There's a lot of opposition to it. Some of it is because businesses don't understand it, but I think much of it is because businesses understand it and say, but there's nothing in it for me. I don't see how this is going to help me. If I'm an importer, this is a 20% tax, and maybe it won't change the prices that I have to pay, but if it does, I lose. So let me say how it would not change those prices. If you think about it as a 20% tax on imports and a 20% subsidy on exports, you'd say, well, that must have the effect of shrinking the U.S. trade deficit. We would be increasing exports and reducing imports. But a fundamental fact in economics is that the trade deficit depends on domestic saving and investment. If you save more than you invest as a nation, you will have a smaller trade deficit or a trade surplus. But there's nothing about the border tax adjustment that will change the savings or the investment of the economy. And therefore, it shouldn't change the trade balance. But how can it not change the trade balance if we're going to be subsidizing exports and taxing imports? And the answer is the value of the dollar should adjust to offset that. So that is Marty Feldstein, professor of economics, speaking. So that's what the theory tells us should happen. And if it happens as the theory suggests, there'll be no increase in the prices to American consumers and no reduction in the prices to American exporters. But as I said, the companies that are in the import business say, well, maybe Professor Feldstein and all those other economists are right, and there'll be no increase in prices, but maybe they'll be wrong. And if they're wrong, we lose. And if they're right, we just sort of break even. So I don't like that kind of bet. It's a bet in which I could come out on the wrong side. So they oppose it. And they oppose it with arguments like, well, it's sure to raise prices to consumers, and that's got a lot of traction in the Congress. So it may not happen. And I think that would be a pity, because if it doesn't happen, how does the Congress finance this large corporate tax cut? If it can't finance the large corporate tax cut, what does it do? So maybe it cuts back on it. Maybe we don't get such a large corporate tax cut. So I don't know what the upshot will be, but I think you understand all the moving parts now and what it will do. Well, I've been saying a lot about the U.S. policies. I don't know that we really have time to go on. You tell me.
Just, yeah, you have to leave here.
I don't have,
9, right?
I think it's a little after 9, so maybe we should
Okay.
just open to questions.
Okay, yes.
So,
As expected, his presentation was brief and quick, but very, very penetrating and insightful as always. He covered the U.S. economic policy regime and its proposed policies in very, very comprehensive way. I'm sure you must be reading a lot of the top news regarding this so-called Trumponomics, the U.S. policy initiatives. And I'm sure he cleared a lot of questions you might have. Well, with this, why don't I invite any comments or questions from the floor? Yes. Dr. Lim, you want? Yes, he is a fellow at KDI and a very good economist there.
Wanyok Lim from KDI. I have a question about border tax adjustment. Back in 27 years ago, you wrote a paper with Paul Krugman on the international effects of VAT, and I thought you were referring to that. But some of the newspaper reports include some provisions about a subsidy for domestic factors of production, like wages, not only the VAT adjustment, border tax adjustment. So I'd like to ask what the final proposal is likely to be. And as you said, even if the dollar value adjusts to keep the prices the same, that'll have some effect on the financial markets, right? Dollar prices. So, given those possibilities, and given the fact, as you pointed out, the business people don't like this, what do you think is the most likely outcome for the corporate tax reform?
So I wouldn't say that business people don't like it. I would say some business people don't like it. So there are two lobbying groups. There are the importers, and they are allied with the oil producers because of the fact that oil is priced globally in dollars. But on the other side, there are big companies like General Electric who say this is a good thing. So it's hard to be confident about what is going to come out of this. I don't think there are going to be extensions of subsidies to wages or anything like that. I think the whole thing could get scaled back so that there's less at risk. There could be delays in implementation, so there would be time for businesses to adjust. But I think right now the leadership is saying, this is the plan, this is what we want.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Kim.
Thank you for your detailed explanation of the U.S. economy. But aside from economic issues, I'd like to ask you a little bit more than economic issues. There's a problem between Korea and China. That's a matter of thought, what we called a kind of missile defense system. Of course, I fully understand. I strongly believe that we have to go together with the United States as an ally. But on the other hand, China is the biggest export market of Korea, almost 25% of our export market. But unfortunately, China is doing a kind of retaliatory measures in a very, cruel way. And according to newspaper, a Chinese newspaper, they are saying that we have so many measures. We have, for example, 100 measures, but now we are implementing just 1 or 2 measures. But the impact on the Korean economy, such as to the field of tourism, to the field of, entertainment or cosmetics, is very gloomy. So I'd like to ask you, what would you suggest us to do? We are really like a situation, a wallet in a nutcracker, actually, right? What should we do?
So,
What would you recommend to the U.S. side to help Korean government in this situation?
So,
Thank you.
no, that's a very important and a very serious question. And of course, it depends on how much you think the North Korean threat to South Korea is, and how much you would benefit from the THAAD missile defense package. So if you say, well, it's really not much of a threat, they really wouldn't do anything irrational, then you try to persuade us that the U.S. shouldn't be providing that kind of missile program. But when I think about North Korea, I think they're very dangerous, and that being able to protect yourself against them is a big plus. Now, so one question is, will they, after seeing that the THAAD missiles are put in place, the radar system put in place, will they then say, well, you're not about to do anything else of this sort, and so we won't keep, quote, punishing South Korea? I don't know enough about the mentality of the Chinese, but if the installation is going to have happened pretty soon, then unless they think that they could force South Korea or the U.S. to take that installation out, which seems unlikely.
Yeah. But before I invite the gentleman there, let me add to what Professor Feldstein just said. Actually, I wrote a couple of times in my newspaper column, and actually I wrote last week about this issue. I'm sure Mr. Kim knows about it, but I think we should bring the case to WTO. And also, the trade is not aid. There are beneficiaries in China, consumers as well as producers, because more than 50% of our exports are intermediate goods and mostly used by Chinese firms for export. That's one point. I think we have to appeal to the international community. And China is aspiring to be the so-called member of G2. And by the way, China still is the member of Troika of G20, which is supposed to advocate free trade. And in fact, Xi Jinping went to Davos this year, and he claimed that he would be, and China will be the champion of free trade. I said then, as it's a rhetoric, and turn into reality will be very, very difficult. But still, China has to play such a leadership role. And then now, next neighbor to us is a very, very really, I would say, it's not very nice, almost nasty, the informal retaliation, which is not good for the image of China and Chinese leadership. So if we appeal to the international community and bring it to WTO, that will publicize what Chinese are doing against the President Xi Jinping and the leadership commitment to free trade. I think this is the way we should be doing. And as I said, aid is an aid. Trade is the win-win thing for both countries. Of course, we depend more on China, but still Chinese will suffer. So far, Chinese are doing not on these manufactured goods, but on tourism and other things. I think they are making a mistake. And if they aspire to be real global leadership, and at least in the regional leadership role, I think they are making mistake. And so we have to appeal to the international community, and that's what we should be doing. And I think we should take it to WTO. Although WTO is not that functioning very well, but still WTO is there, and so we should be doing that.
I'm just wondering if is there any announcement or analysis from the administration regarding the compatibility of this idea with the WTO commitments? In fact, I guess this is from all the measures you mentioned, this one touches directly the heart of the WTO.
Yes, so basically it is the same thing that countries that have value-added taxes do. And so the attitude of the people who have framed that part of the legislation is that this is just the same thing that countries who have a VAT, that they tax imports and rebate on exports, and that's what this would do. So it's not any different. It's essentially doing the same thing. That doesn't mean that other countries won't suggest that it's in violation since we don't have a VAT, but America doesn't want a VAT. And so we're getting, in effect, the same benefits that countries with VAT have, but without the extra layer of domestic taxation.
Good morning. My name is Jay Kim. I'm working on the private energy investment side. Recently, I read an opinion piece by two Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker and George Shultz, proposing carbon tax instead of, a lot of the regulation by Obama administration. Also, carbon tax is relevant to innovation. It can actually spur the innovation of the U.S. company, also relevant to border tax you just mentioned. So I just want to know any kind of the roadmap of the carbon tax side, because it's not just the environmental issue, it's also infrastructure and energy policy of the Trump administration.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that proposal. As you may have seen in it, they said that some others had signed on to that, and I was one of them. So, but the thing that makes it different from an ordinary carbon tax is that the funds collected, the revenue that is collected, would then be given back to the public on a per capita basis. So most people would end up getting more in cash as a rebate than the taxes that they pay that are embedded in, say, the price of gasoline or home heating. So it would have the favorable effect of reducing the demand for carbon products, but would not have the adverse effects on income distribution that usually are seen as a reason to reject a carbon tax. So we are in the process of trying to get more interest and more support for that. I wrote a piece on the same day together with one of my Harvard colleagues, Greg Mankiw, in the New York Times. And I would say I've never had so many emails expressing support for an idea. I write a lot of op-ed pieces, and I get a few comments, but this was overwhelming, and it came across the political spectrum. People saying, yes, this is a good idea. And Jim Baker and I went to the White House and had a chance to talk with senior people there, not the president, but senior people there about this idea. So we'll see whether there is some momentum for it. It's not a way of raising revenue to pay for tax reduction, for corporate tax reduction. It's a revenue neutral proposal.
Okay, the last question from the floor.
예, 한국말로 하겠습니다. 예, 말씀 잘 들었는데요.
Okay, just he's speaking Korean.
Okay. This doesn't have an earpiece.
Yeah, I will go.
I don't think it has an earpiece. No, that's, I see, that was what I should have used.
Yeah, right here. Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay.
예, 의료개혁에 대해서 말씀해 주셨습니다. 제가 드리고 싶은 말은 세 가지인데, 의료개혁에 대해서 첫째가 트럼프 대통령이 오바마 대통령이 추진했던 그 의료개혁하고 무슨 차이가 있는지, 그리고 어떻게 개혁하려고 그러는지, 세 번째는 그게 가능할 거라고 보시는지 궁금합니다. 예.
Obamacare.
Yes. So, yes, I think it is. I think wait, let me get this off.
Yes.
So, will there be a repeal and replace? Yes. And they have a very detailed program for doing it. One of the problems with trying to change the healthcare legislation is that the Democrats will oppose it completely. And so what has to be done is the changes that are being proposed have to be able to pass in the Senate by just 50 votes. And they have a set of proposals which will achieve that for technical reasons, which I don't think everybody here wants to know about reconciliation and all that. But I would say the short answer is yes, we will see enacted a proposal. That's what I said I think will happen by May.
Okay. Let me share your views on this. On private conversations, we talked about it, but at this point, aren't you, are you concerned at all about this distribution side of U.S. economy? And of course, this time, Mr. Trump, you've been talking about. You didn't say much about the personal income tax reform, but then again, the major beneficiaries will be top income earners rather than the workers. So, aren't you concerned, or what's your view on the distributional side of the
Well, the personal tax rate cuts will be offset by broadening the tax base, by putting limits on deductions and credits. The Treasury Secretary said that they will, when they work out the details, it will not be a net windfall for high-income individuals. So we have to wait and see what actually comes out of that process.
Okay. With this, we have to end here, and we have to free Professor Feldstein. Again, I thank you very much for taking time to be with us and sharing your very, very insightful and valuable thoughts on the U.S. economy and the rest of the world. And we took full advantage of his very brief visit to Seoul, and I hope you have a very safe trip to China and to your home country, the America, soon. And we hope to get you back again as early as possible. Possibly sometime early next year. Okay, with this, please join me in appreciating Professor Feldstein's excellent and outstanding presentation.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Good.